April 3rd, 1865. It is 9:49 in the morning. A telegram arrives at the War Department in Washington. The operator reads it. His hands begin to shake. He runs the slip of paper across the street to the White House, and Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, a man who has not slept through a single night in 4 years, reads 4 words that he has been dreaming about since the war began. Richmond has fallen, the Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, the city that Grant had been choking like a python for 9 months. Fallen. Lincoln doesn't cheer. He doesn't throw his hat in the air. He sits down at his desk, puts his long face into his enormous hands, and weeps. Not from joy, not entirely. He weeps because of the telegram he received 3 weeks earlier, a telegram that has never been displayed in a museum, a telegram that most Lincoln biographers mention in footnotes and then quickly move past because its contents are too painful, too honest, and too revealing about the true emotional cost of what this president was carrying in those final weeks of the war. The telegram was from General Ulysses S. Grant. It contained a casualty estimate for the Petersburg campaign, a number so staggering that Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, wrote in his private diary that the president sat reading it for 20 minutes without moving, that he didn't speak for an hour after. The number was 42,000 men. In 9 months of siege warfare, the Army of the Potomac had lost 42,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or captured outside the gates of Petersburg, Virginia. 42,000 men. The population of the city of Providence, Rhode Island, bled out in the Virginia mud to capture 20 miles of railroad track and a city that nobody actually lived in anymore, because Richmond had evacuated most of its civilian population months before. Lincoln kept that telegram in his coat pocket. He carried it with him everywhere for 2 weeks. This is a story that the textbooks skim over. They give you the handsome portrait of Lincoln and the dramatic Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural with its poetry about malice toward none. And all of that is real, and all of that matters. But they rarely show you the Lincoln who sat alone in the telegraph office at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a gray wool shawl, reading the casualty lists as they came in over the wire, night after night after night, calculating in his head the human arithmetic of a war he set in motion and could not stop. To understand what Lincoln was carrying in those final weeks of the war, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the political beginning with the election of 1860 or the secession crisis. You have to go back to the psychological beginning. You have to understand what kind of man Abraham Lincoln actually was before the war turned him into a statue. He was funny. That is the thing that photographs and marble monuments cannot show you. Abraham Lincoln was one of the funniest men in American public life. He told jokes constantly, dirty jokes, self-deprecating jokes, elaborate shaggy dog stories that went on for 10 minutes before the punchline. His cabinet members were frequently mortified by him. He would call them together for an emergency war meeting and open by reading a chapter from a humorist named Artemus Ward that he found hilarious while they sat there in stunned silence, wondering why they were listening to comedy when Virginia was on fire. He used humor the way a carpenter uses a pressure valve. He used it to release what was building up inside him, because what was building up inside him was, by any clinical measure, catastrophic grief. Lincoln lost his son, Willie, in February of 1862. Willie was 11 years old. He got sick with typhoid fever, possibly from contaminated water in the White House cistern, and died in the middle of the war. Mary Lincoln collapsed entirely. She went into a grief that bordered on madness. She held seances in the White House. She stopped eating. She couldn't function. Lincoln was expected to function. He sat with Willie's body in the same building where he was simultaneously directing a war that was going catastrophically wrong. He would leave cabinet meetings to go up to the room where they had laid Willie out and sit there alone in silence. He had Willie's body exhumed twice because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind when he eventually left Washington. He never really recovered. He just absorbed it and kept working. That capacity for absorption, for taking unbearable weight and continuing to move, is the central fact of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, and it is what makes that telegram about the 42,000 men so devastating to understand. Because Lincoln had authorized every one of those deaths, not directly, not by pulling a trigger or signing an execution order, But in March of 1864, when he promoted Ulysses S. Grant to lieutenant general and gave him command of all Union armies, Lincoln knew exactly what he was authorizing. He knew Grant's strategy. He knew it because Grant had told him, bluntly, over a dinner at Willard's Hotel, that the only way to end the war was to destroy the Confederate armies, not capture their cities, not maneuver them out of position, but grind them down, reduce them, make it impossible to replace the losses. Grant said it plainly. The South has a smaller pool of men. If we kill one of theirs for every 2 of ours, we still win. They run out first. Lincoln sat across the table from this short, quiet, cigar-smoking man from Galena, Illinois, and he understood exactly what was being proposed. He was being asked to spend human lives like currency, to authorize an army of 100,000 men to walk into the fire and keep walking until the fire went out. And he said yes. He said yes because the alternatives were worse. He had watched 3 years of what happened when commanders tried to be clever, tried to outmaneuver Lee, tried to win the war without paying the butcher's bill. McClellan had refused to fight. Burnside had fought stupidly. Hooker had fought brilliantly until the moment it counted and then shattered. The war had dragged on so long that by 1864, the Northern public was exhausted and the Democratic Party was running on a peace platform that would have ended the war and saved the Confederacy and preserved slavery indefinitely. Lincoln understood that the only moral path through the horror was to make the horror shorter, to authorize the concentrated brutality of a Grant offensive, because the slow, grinding misery of 3 more years of inconclusive campaigning was worse, not better, worse. But understanding something intellectually and living with it emotionally are 2 entirely different things. There is a story that Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, told after the war. Layman was one of the few people who actually spent significant time with Lincoln at night because Lincoln refused to take his safety seriously, and Layman was perpetually terrified that someone was going to murder the president, which, as it turned out, was not an unreasonable fear. Layman said that Lincoln had the same recurring dream throughout the war. He dreamed that he was walking through the White House and all the rooms were dark and silent, and he could hear the sound of someone weeping, distant and muffled, coming from somewhere in the building. He walked through room after room toward the sound, and finally reached the East Room and pushed open the doors, and inside the room there was a catafalque, a platform with a coffin on it, draped in black, soldiers standing guard. Lincoln walked up to the coffin in the dream and said to one of the soldiers, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier answered, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln had this dream repeatedly throughout the war. He told it to his cabinet. He told it to Mary. He talked about it with a disturbing casual detachment, as if he had already accepted the outcome. He said he wasn't frightened by the dream. He seemed almost resigned to it. What does it do to a man to carry that? To lead a nation through its most destructive war, to authorize the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men, to lose your own son in the middle of it, to receive death threats every day, to conduct the whole operation on roughly 4 hours of sleep, and to do it while you are dreaming every night of your own corpse. It makes you look like the photographs. That is what it does. Look at the photographs of Lincoln in sequence. The 1858 Lincoln before the presidency is a gaunt, homely, almost comical figure. There is something loose and almost goofy about his face. The 1860 Lincoln who won the election has the beginning of the beard and a kind of tentative dignity. The 1863 Lincoln at Gettysburg is recognizable, but still human. The 1865 Lincoln is a different creature entirely. The face in the last photographs looks like it has been carved. The eyes have gone from warm to something that is difficult to name, not cold, not hard, but deep in a way that suggests the bottom cannot be reached. Mary Lincoln, who knew his face better than any human being alive, said in those final months that the lines in it had become trenches. March 4th, 1865, the second inauguration. It rains all morning. The Capitol building is still being finished, the great iron dome not yet complete. The mud in Washington is biblical, the streets a swamp of manure and clay. Lincoln stands at the podium in front of a crowd of enormous size. The crowd includes in the front rows many Black Americans who have walked miles to be there. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery has just passed through Congress. The Confederacy is collapsing. the end is visible. Lincoln opens his mouth. He does not give them a victory speech. He does not give them a celebration or a triumph or a vindication. He gives them something stranger and more enduring. He gives them a speech that sounds, in its cadence and its moral weight, more like the book of Isaiah than a political address. He says that both sides in the war read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, and both invoked that God's aid against the other. He says that the prayers of neither have been fully answered, and that God has his own purposes, which may not align with the purposes of men. He says that if God wills that the war continue until every drop of blood drawn by the lash is paid by another drawn by the sword, then as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said again, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. He is saying that the war might be divine punishment. He is saying that the suffering of the soldiers might be the moral price of 200 years of American slavery. He is saying that he does not fully understand God's purposes and that the nation should be humble in the face of them. It is not the speech of a man who is certain he did everything right. It is the speech of a man who is reckoning. After the second inauguration, Lincoln becomes almost feverishly focused on the terms of peace. He does not want punishment. He does not want trials or executions or humiliation. He wants the rebellion to end and the country to begin again, with malice toward none, with charity toward all. These are not empty words. These are instructions. He tells his cabinet that as soon as a Confederate state lays down its arms, it should be welcomed back. He does not want to hear talk of traitors or war criminals. He wants to turn the page. The radical Republicans in Congress are appalled. They want the Southern aristocracy destroyed. They want land redistribution. They want a hard reconstruction that keeps the rebel states under military occupation for a generation. Lincoln says no. He says the purpose of the war was reunion, not revenge. This is the Lincoln that the telegram about the 42,000 men produced. A man who has been so thoroughly baptized in the cost of the war that he cannot stomach the idea of spending one more drop of blood or one more year of national agony on the politics of punishment. He wants it over. He wants it healed. He wants to live long enough to see it. On April 4th, 1865, the day after Richmond falls, Abraham Lincoln does something that is either the bravest or the most reckless thing a sitting president has ever done. He goes to Richmond. He doesn't ask the generals if it's safe. He doesn't coordinate a formal security operation. He gets on a boat, sails up the James River, walks off the dock into the smoking ruins of the Confederate capital with 12 sailors as his entire escort, and walks through the streets. The city is still burning in places. Confederate dead are still on the ground. The Union Army has only just taken possession. Snipers are a plausible concern. Lincoln walks anyway. The black population of Richmond, the enslaved people who had been waiting for this moment for their entire lives, who had heard the Union guns getting closer for months, who had watched their enslavers flee the city in panic 2 days before, came out into the streets to see him. They surrounded him. They wept. They grabbed his hands. Some fell to their knees. Lincoln, visibly moved and visibly uncomfortable with the kneeling, bent down to one old man and said, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." There are no photographs of this moment, only eyewitness accounts. But every account agrees on the look on Lincoln's face. Not triumphant, not presidential, something simpler and more private. A man who has been carrying an enormous weight, setting some of it down. He walked through Richmond for hours. He sat in Jefferson Davis's chair in the Confederate Executive Mansion. He ran his hand along the surface of the desk. He was quiet. His aide, Admiral David Porter, who was with him, said later that Lincoln sat in that chair for a long time without speaking, and then stood up very deliberately and walked out without looking back. He returned to the boat. He sailed back down the river. He had 11 days to live. Those 11 days are among the most documented in the presidency. Lincoln was in a strange mood. His staff agreed on that. Not manic, not depressed, but something lighter, something they had not seen in years. He slept better. He told more jokes. He was more present in conversation, more engaged, more like the man they had known before the war swallowed him. He met with Grant aboard the River Queen on April 7th. They sat on the deck in the spring sunlight. The war was almost over. Lee was still running, but not for much longer. Lincoln talked about what peace would look like. He was almost cheerful, startlingly so. He told Grant he wanted generous terms. He did not want Lee in prison. He wanted the Confederate soldiers to go home and become good citizens. He wanted it finished. Grant nodded. Grant understood. 2 days later, on Palm Sunday, April 9th, Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and Grant gave terms so generous they surprised everyone who had been paying attention to the political climate in Washington. Let them keep their horses, feed them from Union stores, send them home. Lincoln read the terms and approved them entirely. On April 11th, Lincoln gave his last public speech from a window of the White House to a crowd gathered on the lawn below. The speech was about Reconstruction. It was complicated and political, and the crowd was hoping for something more celebratory. He talked about the challenge of reintegrating the Southern states. He talked about the question of voting rights for black men, particularly, he said, the very intelligent and those who had served in the Union military. He wanted to be careful, but he wanted to move forward. In the crowd below, a young man named John Wilkes Booth stood listening. When Lincoln said those words about voting rights for black men, Booth turned to his companion and said, "That means in citizenship. Now by God I will put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make." 3 days later, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. He did not want to go. He was tired. Mary wanted to go, and he had promised. He went. He laughed during the performance. Witnesses in nearby seats said he laughed out loud during the funny parts. He was sitting in the presidential box leaning forward with his chin resting in his hand. He was watching the stage. He had been told the war was over. He had given his last speech about what came next. He was, for the first time in 4 years, thinking about the future. The shot came at 10:13 in the evening. He died the following morning, April 15, 1865, at 7:22 a.m. He never regained consciousness. He died in a small boarding house across the street from the theater, in a bed too short for his long frame, surrounded by his cabinet and his generals, with Mary wailing in the hallway. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside. He looked at the face of the man who had steered the nation through 4 years of catastrophic war and shouldered a weight that no human being should be required to carry. He stood there for a long moment after the breathing stopped, and then he spoke the sentence that has echoed for 160 years. Now he belongs to the ages. But there is a detail that Stanton's famous line tends to overshadow, a detail that was recorded by the Surgeon General who was also in the room. He noted that when Lincoln died, when the breathing finally stopped and the great ruined face went still, there was a visible change in his expression. The trenches in his face, the deep carved lines that Mary had said looked like trench works, seemed to relax. The shoulders dropped, the hands unclenched. Whatever he had been carrying, he set it down. In the coat he was wearing that night, they found several things when they prepared the body: a pocket watch, a small knife, a Confederate $5 bill, which he had apparently picked up as a souvenir in Richmond, a handkerchief, 2 pairs of spectacles with a repair made using string to hold one frame together, and a newspaper clipping. It was creased and worn from being handled many times, folded and unfolded until the paper had gone soft at the crease lines. It was a clipping from a British newspaper, an editorial that praised Lincoln's conduct of the war and called him a man of the people. Abraham Lincoln, who was mocked constantly in the American press, who was called an ape and a tyrant and a fool, who was drawn in cartoons as a baboon and a despot, who received death threats in the morning mail, who lost his son in this house and his sanity in small daily increments for 4 years, carried in his coat pocket a single piece of paper that said someone, somewhere, thought he was doing the right thing. He carried it until the night he died. That is the Lincoln that the marble statue cannot show you. Not the monument, not the address, not the image on the penny. The man in the cracked spectacles held together with string, carrying a newspaper clipping from across the ocean in his pocket, walking into the darkness of a war he could not stop and could not survive, because the only alternative was letting the country break apart. The telegram about the 42,000 men, the dream about his own corpse, the old man kneeling in the streets of Richmond that he had to ask to stand up. The newspaper clipping warns soft with handling. This is what it costs to hold a nation together. This is what the textbooks skip.